1. The Hitchhiker's Warning. I was never the kind of person who picked up hitchhikers. I had heard too many horror stories, seen too many news reports about people disappearing after offering a stranger a ride. But that night, something about him made me stop. It wasn't the way he looked, just an average man in a dark hoodie, standing on the side of a long, empty highway. It was the way he stood there, completely still, staring at the road like he had been waiting for me specifically. I should have kept driving. I should have ignored the nagging feeling in my gut. But I was tired, and the next town was still an hour away. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity, but my hands moved before my brain could argue. I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Where you headed?" My voice came out shaky. He turned his head slowly, like he hadn't expected me to stop. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see on someone who knows something you don't. "Just a few miles up," he said. His voice was calm, steady. Too steady. I hesitated, but before I could change my mind, he was already opening the door and sliding into the passenger seat. The car suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. The smell of damp clothes and something metallic clung to him. I couldn't place it, but something about him made the hair on my arm stand up. We drove in silence for a while. He didn't fidget, didn't look around the car like most passengers would. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his hands resting on his lap. I tried to focus on the road, but I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against my chest. "You driving all night?" he finally asked. I nodded. "Yeah. Heading to see my brother. Haven't seen him in a while." That was a lie. I didn't have a brother. I don't know why I said that. Maybe I just didn't want this man to know I was alone. He didn't respond, just nodded slowly, as if he already knew the truth. A few minutes passed, and then he spoke again. "You should turn off at the next exit." I frowned. "Why? There's nothing there." His expression didn't change. "Just trust me. Take the next exit." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. He wasn't suggesting it, he was telling me. And the way he said it, like he already knew I would listen, made my stomach twist. "I think I'll just stay on this road," I said, forcing a laugh. "It's a straight shot to where I'm going." He turned his head slowly, finally looking at me for the first time since he got in the car. His eyes were dark, too dark, like they absorbed the dim light from the dashboard. "You don't want to go straight?" My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Why not?" Silence. Then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he said, "Because if you keep going, you won't make it." A chill ran down my spine. I laughed again, but it came out weak. "That's supposed to be a threat?" He shook his head. "Number just a warning." Something about the way he said it, so certain, so final, made my stomach drop. The exit sign appeared up ahead. I told myself I wouldn't do it, but as I got closer, my hands betrayed me. I flicked on the turn signal and took the exit. The second I did, my headlights illuminated something in the distance. A massive wreck blocking the road ahead, twisted metal and shattered glass reflecting the moonlight. If I had kept going straight, I would have plowed right into it. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pulled over, hands shaking. I turned to the hitchhiker, ready to ask how he knew. But the seat was empty. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car shift. He was just gone. The door was locked. The seatbelt was still fastened. But he wasn't there. A cold dread settled in my bones. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but there wasn't one. He had been there. I had spoken to him. He had warned me. I looked at the wreck again. The highway was deserted, no flashing lights, no emergency responders. It must have happened recently. But how did he know? Shaking, I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I sat there for what felt like forever, trying to piece together what had just happened. Finally, I forced myself to start the car and take a different route. The rest of the drive was a blur. My hands never stopped shaking. Every time I glanced at the passenger seat, expecting to see him there, my heart pounded, but the seat remained empty. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a diner, needing to get out of the car to clear my head. The waitress noticed my pale face and trembling hands. "You okay, hun?" she asked. I hesitated, then told her everything. Her face changed, the color draining from it. "Where'd you pick him up?" I told her the highway, and watched as her expression darkened. "You're not the first," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That stretch of road, 20 years ago, a man died hitchhiking, hit by a truck. No one stopped for him. Now, sometimes, he warns people." I felt my stomach drop. "Warns them about what?" She swallowed hard. "About the wrecks, about what's coming. He only ever gets into cars that are heading straight toward an accident." My breath hitched. I thought of his eerie stillness, the way he seemed to be waiting for me, the way he knew. A shiver ran through me. I left the diner and sat in my car for a long time, staring at the empty seat beside me. I had survived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just warning people. He was looking for something or someone, and one day he might not just vanish. Story number 2. Motel room 404. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped into that motel room. The air was thick with a damp, musty smell, like the walls had absorbed years of misery. The dim yellow light flickered as if it was struggling to stay alive. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, the kind that looked like it hadn't been changed in decades. But it was late, and I was exhausted. I had been driving for hours, and my body ached for rest. The man at the front desk had given me a key without a word, barely glancing up from whatever old book he was reading. His silence had unsettled me, but I told myself I was overthinking. It was just a cheap roadside motel. Nothing fancy, nothing strange. At least that's what I thought. I tossed my bag onto the chair, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the bed. It creaked under my weight. The room felt too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that made you hyper-aware of every breath you took, every rustling sound outside the door. I reached for the remote and turned on the TV, but it only showed static. I flipped through the channels. Nothing. Just static, and the faintest whisper of voices beneath the white noise. My fingers froze on the remote. The voices weren't coming from the TV. I muted it. The whispers continued. I held my breath, listening. It was faint, but unmistakable, like dozens of voices murmuring at once, too quiet to make out the words. My eyes darted to the closet. The sound seemed to be coming from inside. A chill crawled up my spine. I shook my head, forcing out a laugh. I was just tired, that was all. My brain was playing tricks on me. I stood up and walked over to the closet. My hand hesitated on the handle. The murmuring stopped. The silence was even worse. My pulse pounded in my ears. Slowly I pulled the door open. Nothing. Just an empty space with an old wooden hanger swaying slightly, as if it had just been disturbed. I let out a shaky breath and shut the door. I needed sleep. I climbed into bed, pulling the thin sheets over me, and told myself to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at my chest. But sleep never came. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. My body locked up. I wasn't near the window. I wasn't even facing it. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, patient. I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe it was just a tree branch. Maybe I was still half dreaming. Then I heard the whisper, right by my ear. "Check the guest book." I bolted upright, my breath caught in my throat. The room was empty, but something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence sharper, like the walls were pressing in on me. My heart hammered as I scanned the room. Nothing had changed, except for one thing. The drawer of the nightstand was open. I didn't remember opening it. My hands trembled as I reached inside. My fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. I pulled it out. A leather-bound book. The guest book. I flipped it open. Names, dates, messages. Some were ordinary. Great stay, or nice place, friendly staff. But as I turned the pages, the handwriting became frantic, desperate. "Don't sleep here. They come at night. If you hear the whispers, it's already too late." I swallowed hard. My eyes darted to the last entry, written in shaky, uneven letters. They're watching. The room suddenly felt freezing. My breath came out in shallow gasps. I slammed the book shut and threw it back into the drawer, tap, tap, tap the window. Slowly I turned my head. A shadow. A tall, thin figure stood just outside the glass, its face obscured by the darkness. My chest tightened. The motel was a single-story building. There was no ledge, no balcony, no reason for anyone to be standing outside my window. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Then it leaned closer and I saw its face, or rather the absence of one. A blank, smooth surface where features should have been. No eyes, no mouth, just a void. The whispers grew louder. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my keys. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. The moment my hand touched the doorknob, the whispers stopped. The air went deathly still. I turned the handle. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked harder. Locked. My chest heaved, my fingers fumbled with the lock, twisting, turning, but it wouldn't open. Then I felt it. A presence behind me. The cold breath of something that shouldn't be there. A hand on my shoulder. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, speeding down the highway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The motel shrank in my rearview mirror, its sign flickering in and out of existence. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. I pulled into a diner, still shaking. The waitress poured me coffee and asked if I was okay. I hesitated. Then, against my better judgment, I asked, "That motel down the road, do people stay there often?" She froze. "What motel?" she asked. "The one near the last exit," I said, my voice unsteady. She shook her head, her face pale. "There hasn't been a motel there in years. It burned down a long time ago." I stared at her, my blood running cold. She must have seen the look on my face because she leaned in, lowering her voice. "They say people still see it sometimes," she whispered. "Only at night. People check in, but no one ever checks out." I didn't say another word. I just left, got in my car, and drove. I haven't taken a road trip since. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Stale air, old dust, something rotten lingering underneath. The aisles were empty, the shelves half-stocked with faded packages that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The cashier's counter was abandoned, the register open, empty. Then I heard it, a soft shuffle, from the back of the store. I froze, my skin prickling. "Hello?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. No answer. Just the faint creak of something shifting in the darkness beyond the aisles. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how wrong this place felt. The air was thick, charged with something unseen. I needed to leave. Now. But as I turned, I saw something in the corner of my eye. The guest book. It sat on the counter open, its pages filled with names. Too many names. I frowned. Who would sign a guest book at a gas station? Then I noticed the dates. Each name was followed by a date. The last one was from last night, but there was something else. A second date. Every name had two dates. The first, the day they arrived. The second, the day they disappeared. I took a step back, my breath coming fast. My eyes darted to the last name on the list. The ink was fresh. The name was mine. I hadn't signed anything. My stomach twisted into a knot. My hands shook as I reached for the book, flipping back through the pages. Name after name, hundreds of them, all with two dates. No one had signed out. A cold breath slid down my neck. I spun around. No one. The store was empty, but the air had changed. It was colder, suffocating, as if something unseen was closing in. My skin burned with the feeling of being watched. Then the lights flickered, and I saw them. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Stale air, old dust, something rotten lingering underneath. The aisles were empty, the shelves half-stocked with faded packages that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The cashier's counter was abandoned, the register open, empty. Then I heard it, a soft shuffle, from the back of the store. I froze, my skin prickling. "Hello?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. No answer. just the faint creak of something shifting in the darkness beyond the aisles. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how wrong this place felt. The air was thick, charged with something unseen. I needed to leave. Now. But as I turned, I saw something in the corner of my eye. The guest book. It sat on the counter open, its pages filled with names. Too many names. I frowned. Who would sign a guest book at a gas station? Then I noticed the dates. Each name was followed by a date. The last one was from last night, but there was something else. A second date. Every name had 2 dates. The first, the day they arrived. The second, the day they disappeared. I took a step back, my breath coming fast. My eyes darted to the last name on the list. The ink was fresh. The name was mine. I hadn't signed anything. My stomach twisted into a knot. My hands shook as I reached for the book, flipping back through the pages. Name after name, hundreds of them, all with 2 dates. No one had signed out. A cold breath slid down my neck. I spun around. No one. The store was empty, but the air had changed. It was colder, suffocating, as if something unseen was closing in. My skin burned with the feeling of being watched. Then the lights flickered, and I saw them. Reflected in the glass of the refrigerator doors behind me, shadows, tall, unmoving figures standing in the aisles, watching. I didn't dare turn around. My chest tightened. My hands trembled. I forced myself to breathe, to move. Slowly, carefully, I stepped toward the door, my eyes locked on the reflection. The shadows didn't move, but I knew they were waiting. The door was only a few steps away. The lights flickered again. The reflection changed. They were closer. I ran. I slammed through the door, nearly tripping as I stumbled outside. The night felt different. Too still. The gas station loomed behind me, its sign flickering weakly. I didn't look back. I jumped into my car, turned the key. The engine sputtered. My hands shook as I twisted the key again, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It wouldn't start. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement. The figures were standing at the edge of the station's light, just beyond the pumps, watching, waiting. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I slammed my fist against the dashboard. The engine roared to life. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just floored it. The tires screeched against the pavement as I tore down the road, the gas station shrinking behind me. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I was miles away. Finally, when the adrenaline faded just enough, I pulled over, gasping for air. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I pulled out my phone, desperate for a signal. It was back. I searched for the gas station, for anything about it. Nothing. Story number 4. The passenger in the rearview mirror. I first saw her in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just a shadow, a reflection. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours, my eyes sore from staring at the endless stretch of highway ahead. It was past midnight, the roads were deserted, and all I wanted was to get to my motel and crash. But then I saw her again. A woman sitting in the back seat. I slammed on the brakes so hard my car skidded. My heart was pounding, hands gripping the wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. I twisted around, breath caught in my throat. The back seat was empty. I sat there, frozen, the car idling on the dark highway. I told myself I was just exhausted. Maybe I had zoned out for too long, maybe my brain had conjured up some nonsense to keep me entertained. Shaking it off, I put the car in drive and kept going. A few miles later, she was there again. Same spot, same empty, expressionless stare. This time I didn't stop. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. I could feel her watching me, but I refused to look. I wasn't alone. Something was in the car with me. I took a sharp turn onto an exit, hoping the movement would shake off whatever hallucination my brain had cooked up. But when I glanced back in the mirror, she was still there. Closer this time. I gripped the wheel so hard my fingers ached. A pair of headlights, a car parked across the road blocking the way. 4 figures stood beside it, motionless, their faces hidden in the darkness. I didn't slow down. I knew deep in my gut that stopping meant something bad, something final. My breath came out in ragged gasps. I swerved to the right, nearly losing control as my tires skidded on the asphalt. I barely missed the parked car, the figures not moving an inch as I sped past. For a split second, I saw their faces, empty, hollow, like dolls with their features smoothed over. My stomach turned, bile rising in my throat. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The road was empty again, nothing but darkness stretching ahead. I stole another glance at the mirror. The woman was still there, but this time she wasn't looking at me. She was looking behind us, watching. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost sad. "Keep going." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. My body screamed for me to stop, to pull over, to breathe, but I couldn't, not yet. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I had no idea how long I drove. The darkness outside felt endless. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. I glanced in the mirror. Nothing but my empty back seat. The weight on my chest lifted, the suffocating presence evaporating like mist. A sign appeared up ahead, "Motel, 2 miles." I exhaled a shaky breath and kept driving. The motel was a small, run-down place, the kind you'd expect in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign flickered weakly as I pulled into the parking lot. My hands were still trembling as I killed the engine and climbed out. The night was eerily silent. No crickets, no wind, just a stillness that made my skin crawl. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as I checked in. He slid the key across the counter without a word. As I turned to leave, he finally spoke. "You took the back road, didn't you?" I froze. Slowly, I turned to face him. "Yeah." "Why?" His expression didn't change. "You see her?" My breath hitched. "Who?" He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Never mind." I swallowed hard. My mouth felt dry. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, like he was debating whether to tell me. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Years ago, a woman was driving down that road at night. She saw a car blocking the way, stopped to help." He paused. "She was never seen again." A chill ran through me. "But people still see her," he continued. "She only shows up for those who take the back road, and she only says one thing." I felt my stomach twist. "Don't stop," I whispered. He nodded. A sick, sinking feeling settled in my gut. I turned without another word and walked to my room, locking the door behind me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The woman had saved me. If I had stopped for those figures. I didn't want to think about it. I never took that road again. And now, whenever I drive at night, I keep my eyes on the rearview mirror, just in case. A pair of headlights, a car parked across the road blocking the way. 4 figures stood beside it, motionless, their faces hidden in the darkness. I didn't slow down. I knew deep in my gut that stopping meant something bad, something final. My breath came out in ragged gasps. I swerved to the right, nearly losing control as my tires skidded on the asphalt. I barely missed the parked car, the figures not moving an inch as I sped past. For a split second, I saw their faces, empty, hollow, like dolls with their features smoothed over. My stomach turned, bile rising in my throat. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The road was empty again, nothing but darkness stretching ahead. I stole another glance at the mirror. The woman was still there, but this time she wasn't looking at me. She was looking behind us, watching. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost sad. "Keep going." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. My body screamed for me to stop, to pull over, to breathe, but I couldn't, not yet. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I had no idea how long I drove. The darkness outside felt endless. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. I glanced in the mirror. Nothing but my empty back seat. The weight on my chest lifted, the suffocating presence evaporating like mist. A sign appeared up ahead, motel 2 miles. I exhaled a shaky breath and kept driving. The motel was a small, run-down place, the kind you'd expect in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign flickered weakly as I pulled into the parking lot. My hands were still trembling as I killed the engine and climbed out. The night was eerily silent. No crickets, no wind, just a stillness that made my skin crawl. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as I checked in. He slid the key across the counter without a word. As I turned to leave, he finally spoke. "You took the back road, didn't you?" I froze. Slowly, I turned to face him. "Yeah." "Why?" His expression didn't change. "You see her?" My breath hitched. "Who?" He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Never mind." I swallowed hard. My mouth felt dry. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, like he was debating whether to tell me. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Years ago, a woman was driving down that road at night. She saw a car blocking the way, stopped to help." He paused. "She was never seen again." A chill ran through me. "But people still see her," he continued. "She only shows up for those who take the back road, and she only says one thing." I felt my stomach twist. "Don't stop," I whispered. He nodded. A sick, sinking feeling settled in my gut. I turned without another word and walked to my room, locking the door behind me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The woman had saved me. If I had stopped for those figures. I didn't want to think about it. I never took that road again. And now, whenever I drive at night, I keep my eyes on the rearview mirror, just in case. No listings, no records. It didn't exist. I checked the guest book again, my name, my date, the second date, tomorrow. My stomach twisted. I turned my car back toward the highway. I wasn't stopping again. I wasn't taking any more shortcuts. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed. I don't want to find out. The rest stop ritual. I should have never stopped at that rest area. It was past midnight, and I had been driving for hours. My eyelids were heavy, my body aching from sitting in the same position for too long. The next town was still miles away, and my brain was screaming for rest. When I saw the sign for a rest stop up ahead, I hesitated. It was one of those older ones, just a handful of vending machines and a few dimly lit picnic tables. No gas station, no convenience store, just a lonely patch of pavement surrounded by thick trees. Something about it felt off, but exhaustion clouded my judgment, and I pulled in anyway. The parking lot was empty. Not a single other car in sight. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The air was still, unnaturally quiet. I killed the engine and leaned back, exhaling slowly. Just a few minutes, I told myself. Just enough to close my eyes, stretch my legs, maybe grab a snack from the vending machine. Then I noticed something. The benches near the vending machines weren't empty. People were sitting there. At first I felt relief, at least I wasn't alone. But as my eyes adjusted, something about them sent a cold wave of unease crawling up my spine. They weren't moving. 6 people, dressed in dark clothing, sitting completely still, facing forward. They didn't talk. They didn't eat. They didn't even glance in my direction. Just sat there, staring straight ahead. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the steering wheel. Something about them felt wrong. Their posture was too rigid, their presence too unnatural. My gut screamed at me to leave, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe they were a weird group of travelers. Maybe they were waiting for someone. But then, as I reached for my water bottle, I caught something in the corner of my eye. They had all turned their heads, all 6 of them. At the exact same time, facing me. My breath caught in my throat, my skin prickled with a deep primal fear. I didn't move, didn't blink, just stared back, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, slowly, in perfect unison, they stood up. I didn't think. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse. My tires screeched as I sped backward, barely controlling the wheel. But as I peeled out of the parking lot, my headlights swept across the rest stop and the people were gone. The benches were empty. The vending machine stood silent. The place looked abandoned, as if no one had been there in years. The benches were empty. The vending machine stood silent. The place looked abandoned, as if no one had been there in years. My chest tightened. My fingers dug into the steering wheel. I kept driving, refusing to look back, refusing to even breathe too hard. But 10 miles down the road, my headlights caught movement, people, 6 of them, standing in the middle of the highway, waiting. I slammed on the brakes, my heart nearly bursting out of my chest. My breath came out in ragged gasps. The figures stood perfectly still, their faces obscured by the darkness. My entire body screamed at me to turn around, to floor it, to do anything but sit there. But before I could react, they moved. Not toward me, closer to each other. Their bodies twisted, bones cracking as they merged. Their limbs stretched unnaturally, their forms melting into one another until they became something else entirely. Something tall. Something wrong. Its arms were too long, its neck bending at an unnatural angle. Its head twitched, tilting as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, in a voice that didn't belong in this world, it spoke. You stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It took a step forward. I threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas. The tires screeched as I sped backward, my entire body shaking. The creature didn't chase me. It didn't have to. It just watched. I don't remember how long I drove. Hours, maybe. I didn't stop until the sun was rising, until I saw the familiar lights of a small town up ahead. Only then did I pull over, my entire body trembling. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages, no signal. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never stop at a rest area again. And if you ever find yourself on an empty highway, feeling tired, desperate for a break, keep driving, no matter how exhausted you are, because some stops aren't meant for people like us. Story number 6. GPS to nowhere. I should have listened to my instincts the moment the GPS took me off the highway. I'd been driving all night, trying to make it home before sunrise. The highway had been empty, nothing but the hum of my engine and the occasional glow of headlights in the distance. Then, without warning, my GPS rerouted me, flashing a new path on the screen. It didn't make sense. I hadn't missed any exits, and I knew the way. But the map insisted. Faster route detected. I hesitated. The new road was narrow, winding through thick forests, barely wide enough for 2 cars. No streetlights, no signs. Just darkness stretching endlessly ahead. Something about it felt wrong. But exhaustion clouded my judgment, and I convinced myself I was overthinking. I took the turn. The road was eerily quiet. No houses, no cars, not even a single mailbox. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers blocking out the sky. My high beams cut through the blackness, but the deeper I drove, the more suffocating the air became. Then I saw the first sign, a wooden post with faded red letters. No exit. I frowned. That wasn't possible. The GPS showed an intersection up ahead, a way back to the highway. I kept driving. A few miles later, another sign appeared. Turn back. The letters were uneven, almost like they had been scratched in. My stomach tightened. I glanced at the GPS. The map had stopped updating. The blue line was frozen, my car icon stuck in place. I slowed down. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding and curving, but never reaching an intersection. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. The uneasy feeling in my gut turned into something worse, something that made my skin crawl. I wasn't supposed to be here. Then I saw it. A car parked on the side of the road. The headlights were off, but the driver's door was open. As I passed, I caught a glimpse inside. The seats were empty. The keys still in the ignition. A half-finished coffee sat in the cup holder. Whoever had been in that car had left in a hurry. A dark, endless stretch of nothingness, like the world had been swallowed whole. The trees had disappeared. The pavement had vanished. There was no way back, only forward. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my throat. I turned back to the man, but he was gone. The road ahead stretched into darkness, twisting deeper into the unknown. I had no choice. I drove. The further I went, the worse it got. The signs on the side of the road no longer made sense. Some were in languages I didn't recognize. Others were just symbols, circles, triangles, strange markings that made my head ache when I looked at them too long. The shadows in the trees grew closer. I could see shapes now, faces, watching, waiting. I pressed harder on the gas. The speedometer climbed, but the road stretched on, endless. My headlights flickered. The radio turned on by itself, static filling the car. Then through the static, a voice, software whispering. You were never meant to leave. My vision blurred. My hands felt numb. The road ahead began to change. The pavement cracked, splitting open, revealing something underneath. Something moving. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I blinked. The highway was in front of me. The normal, familiar highway. Cars rushed past in the distance. Streetlights glowed in the night. I was back. I slammed on the brakes, pulling onto the shoulder, my entire body shaking. I checked the GPS. The map had reset, showing me miles away from where I had been. But something was wrong. The trip history was blank. There was no record of the detour, no sign I had ever taken that road. I sat there for a long time trying to make sense of it, but deep down, I already knew the truth. That place wasn't supposed to exist, and somehow I had found it. Or worse, it had found me. I don't take shortcuts anymore. I don't trust GPS reroutes, because some roads don't lead anywhere, and some roads don't let you leave. Story number 7. The man in the trunk. I should have never opened the trunk. I was halfway through a long drive, just me and the open road, heading home after visiting an old friend. The night stretched out ahead, dark and endless, my headlights cutting through the emptiness. The highway was deserted, not a single car in sight. It was just me, my music, and the hum of the engine. Then I heard it. A soft thud from the back of the car. I frowned, glancing in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. Maybe something had shifted in the trunk. A loose bag, a water bottle rolling around. I tried to shake it off, but a few minutes later the noise came again. Thud. This time it was louder. I felt a chill creep down my spine. I knew every inch of my car, and there was nothing in the trunk that could be making that noise. My mind started spinning through possibilities. Maybe I had hit something. Maybe an animal had gotten caught somewhere. I pulled over onto the side of the road, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. The highway was completely silent. No cars, no wind, just an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I stepped out, my breath visible in the cold night air. The trunk loomed in front of me, the metal gleaming under the dim glow of the taillights. My fingers hesitated over the latch. Then, just as I was about to open it, the car shook. Not like the wind had hit it, not like a passing truck had rattled it. Something inside the trunk moved, a frantic, desperate scratching against the metal. My heart slammed against my ribs. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back in the car and drive, but my hand had already gripped the handle. I lifted the trunk. At first there was nothing. Just the spare tire, the old blanket, the usual things I kept back there. But the second my eyes adjusted, I saw fingers. Pale, thin fingers curling out from under the spare tire. I stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping my throat. My vision blurred for a second, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Then it moved again. A slow, deliberate shift, the hand dragging itself forward, revealing more. A wrist, an arm, something else, something wrong. The air turned ice cold. My breath hitched in my throat. That was when I saw its face, or rather the lack of one. A smooth, featureless expanse where eyes, a mouth, a nose should have been. The skin was stretched too tight, like something was wearing it wrong. It cocked its head at me as if it was listening, even though it had no ears. Then it started crawling out. I slammed the trunk shut so fast I nearly crushed my own fingers. My entire body was shaking, my pulse hammering so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I sprinted back to the driver's seat and locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the keys. The car roared to life and I slammed on the gas, not daring to look back. The road blurred as I sped down the highway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced. What the hell had I just seen? How did it get in my trunk? Then I heard it again. Thud. I nearly lost control of the car. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel. Another thud. Louder this time, angrier. It was still in there. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I needed to get rid of it. A rest stop appeared up ahead, its single streetlight flickering weakly. Without thinking, I swerved into the lot, tires screeching as I came to a stop. I jumped out, heart pounding, chest heaving. My hands shook violently as I grabbed a tire iron from the back seat. This time I didn't hesitate. I yanked the trunk open, swinging the tire iron before I even saw what was inside. But the trunk was empty, no fingers, no face, nothing. I stared, my mind struggling to keep up. My whole body was shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then I saw it, the inside of the trunk, scratched, torn, dented from the inside out. My stomach twisted. I hadn't imagined it. It had been real. I slammed the trunk shut, my hands still trembling. My legs felt like they could barely hold me up. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I needed to get away from here. I got back in the car, locking the doors, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. The moment my hands touched the wheel, I saw it. The trunk was open. I hadn't opened it. It had opened itself. A cold, suffocating fear coiled around my chest. I turned my head slowly, my heart hammering. The back seat was empty, but the trunk was wide open, and the thing was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until the sun rose, until the fear inside me dulled just enough for me to think straight. I stopped at a mechanic later that morning, pretending I had issues with my trunk latch. I just needed someone else to see it, to confirm what I already knew. The guy gave me a strange look. "Your trunk's fine," he said, "but, this is weird." He pointed at the inside. The scratches were gone. The metal was smooth, untouched, like nothing had ever been there. I didn't argue. I just got back in my car and kept driving. But I know what I saw. I know what I let out. And I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, for the next person who dares to open their trunk in the middle of the night. Story number 8. The road that eats cars. I should have never stopped for gas. The station was barely visible from the highway, a dim, flickering neon sign struggling to stay lit. I had been driving for hours, my fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. There wasn't another town for miles, and I didn't have a choice. As I pulled in, I noticed something strange. The pumps looked old, rusted, like they hadn't been used in years. The building itself was small, a single-store structure with windows so dirty I couldn't see inside. But the open sign was glowing. I killed the engine and stepped out, my boots crunching against the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and something else, something sour, metallic, the kind of smell that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no one outside, no other cars, no attendant, but I could feel it. Someone was watching me. I walked toward the store, glancing at the windows. The inside was dimly lit, but I could just barely make out a figure behind the counter. A man, standing perfectly still. I pushed open the door, the small bell above jingling weakly. The moment I stepped inside, the heavy smell of dust and rot filled my lungs. My boots stuck slightly to the floor as if something had been spilled and left to dry. The man behind the counter didn't react. He was old, his skin waxy and pale, his hands resting on the counter like he had been placed there and forgotten. His eyes were open but unblinking, staring at nothing. "Pump's not working," I said, my voice hoarse. "Can I pay inside?" No response. My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. I took a step closer, my eyes scanning the shelves. Most of them were empty, the remaining items coated in thick layers of dust. A candy bar near the register had expired in 1997. Then I noticed the guest book. It sat open beside the register, the pages yellowed, the ink faded. Names, dozens of them, scribbled in shaky handwriting. Each name had a date beside it. The last one was from last night. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What's this?" I asked, pointing at the book. The old man blinked. The sound of it, just that small, natural movement, made my skin crawl. Slowly, his eyes shifted to meet mine. His lips parted, his voice cracking like it hadn't been used in years. "Sign the book." His hand twitched toward a pen. My pulse thundered. "What for?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, waiting. I took a step back, my body screaming at me to leave. But then, from somewhere deeper in the store on, I heard footsteps. Not just one set. Multiple, coming from the back room. The old man's lips twitched, not quite a smile, more like a reflex. I turned and bolted. The door was heavier than I remembered, the air outside too thick, pressing against me like invisible hands trying to hold me back. I stumbled toward my car, fumbling with my keys. That's when I saw the other cars. Lined up behind the station, at least a dozen of them, old, rusted, empty. I yanked open my door and jumped in, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. I slammed the gas, peeling out of the lot so fast my tires screeched. The station disappeared behind me, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop driving. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror, not until I was miles away back on the highway. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. My heart was still hammering, my palms slick with sweat. I reached for my phone to check my GPS, needing some sense of normalcy. But my signal was gone, and my trip history completely erased, like I had never been there at all. I don't know what would have happened if I had signed that book, but I know one thing. That gas station wasn't meant for people like me, and if you ever see a place like that, a station that shouldn't be there, with an old man who doesn't blink, keep driving. Story number 9. The silent gas station. I should have never taken that road. I was already running late, trying to make up time after a wrong turn. The highway was long behind me, replaced by winding roads that snaked through dense woods. My GPS had rerouted me through what it claimed was a shortcut, a small, unnamed road that barely looked like it had been driven on in years. I didn't question it. I just wanted to get home. The deeper I drove, the worse it got. The trees on either side grew taller, their branches stretching overhead like twisted fingers, blocking out the moonlight. The pavement cracked and faded, soon turning into rough, uneven gravel. My high beams barely cut through the thick fog that had begun to settle over the road. Then I saw the first sign, a wooden post, barely visible in the dark, with faded black letters that read, "Turn back now." I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the wheel. Probably some old joke, a leftover from teenagers trying to scare off outsiders. But something about the way it stood there, barely visible through the mist, made my stomach tighten. I ignored it and kept driving. A mile later, another sign appeared. "This road doesn't forgive." My hands felt clammy against the wheel. The fog thickened, swallowing the trees, the road, everything around me. It felt like I was driving through nothingness, an endless stretch of dark with no landmarks, no turns, no sign that I was getting anywhere. Then my headlights caught movement. A figure stood on the side of the road. A woman. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered dress that clung to her thin frame. Her head was down, long dark hair covering her face. She didn't move, didn't react to my approaching car. I slowed down instinctively, but the moment my foot touched the brake, her head snapped up. Her face was wrong. Her mouth was too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. Her eyes were nothing but black, empty voids. She smiled. My entire body seized with fear. I slammed my foot on the gas, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped past her. But just as I did, I heard it. A whisper, low, software right in my ear. "You're already dead." I nearly lost control of the car. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking as I forced myself to focus on the road. But the fog was too thick. It clung to my windshield, swirling unnaturally, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I kept driving, kept praying that the road would end soon. But then I saw the lights. Up ahead, faint and flickering through the mist, a row of headlights shone in the distance. Relief flooded my chest. Other cars, civilization. I wasn't alone. I pressed the gas, desperate to catch up, but the closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The cars weren't moving. They were wrecks, dozens of them, rusted and broken, piled on top of each other like a twisted graveyard. My headlights illuminated shattered windshields, torn metal, doors hanging open as if their passengers had fled in terror. Then I saw the bodies. They stood in front of the wrecks, rows of them, silent, motionless, watching me. Their faces were twisted copies of the woman I had seen earlier, the same stretched mouths, the same black empty eyes. I slammed the brakes, my breath caught in my throat. The whispers started again. Not just one this time, hundreds layered over each other, whispering in a language I didn't understand. Then, as one, the figures took a step forward. My body went numb. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to drive, to get away. But my hands wouldn't move, my legs felt like lead. The whispers grew louder, then something grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, my vision blurred. The world shifted around me, like reality itself had torn apart. And suddenly, I was back on the highway. My car was parked on the shoulder, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. The road ahead was empty. No fog, no figures, no wrecks. Just the open highway. I checked my phone. It was the same time as when I had first taken that detour, as if none of it had happened. But I know it did, because when I finally forced myself to keep driving, when I made it home and got out of the car, there were handprints on my backseat window, and they weren't mine. Story number 10. The wrong ride home. I should have never stopped at that diner. I was driving through a back road trying to make up for lost time. It was one of those stretches of highway where nothing existed for miles, just endless trees and a narrow, cracked road that seemed to stretch on forever. My gas tank was low, my stomach was empty, and the only sign of civilization was an old, run-down diner glowing faintly in the distance. It was the kind of place that looked abandoned, even when it wasn't. The neon open sign buzzed weakly in the window, casting a sickly red glow on the parking lot. A few cars were parked outside, but something about them was off. They were covered in dust, like they hadn't moved in years. I hesitated, but hunger won over logic. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old grease and something else, something rotting. The place was nearly empty. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned, wiping down an already clean surface. There were customers, but they weren't eating. A man sat in a booth near the window, staring at the table. His plate was full, but his fork never moved. In the corner, a woman sat stiffly, her coffee cup untouched, her fingers twitching slightly. And then there was a child at the far end of the diner, her small hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes locked onto mine the moment I walked in. No one blinked. A chill ran through me. I almost turned around and left right then. But the waitress finally moved, turning toward me with a too-wide smile. "Have a seat, hon," she said. Her voice was flat, like she was reading from a script. I took a booth near the door, my fingers drumming against the sticky tabletop. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay. The waitress slid a menu in front of me. It was old, yellowed, the edges curled from years of neglect. The food options were wrong. Raw meat platter, glass soup, something that only had a single word. Them. My throat went dry. I looked up, my pulse hammering. Do you have just a burger?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The waitress just stood there, staring. Too long, too still. Then she nodded, and "Sure, hun." She didn't write it down. She just turned and walked toward the kitchen, her movements too smooth, too precise. I glanced at the other customers again. They hadn't moved an inch. The little girl was still watching me. Her lips barely moved, but I heard her voice clear as day. "Don't eat." A cold shiver crawled up my spine. The door to the kitchen swung open, and for a split second, I saw something wrong. The cooks weren't cooking. They weren't even human. Their bodies were stretched, elongated, their limbs bending in ways that bones shouldn't allow. Their faces were missing, just smooth, blank skin where their features should have been. Then the door swung shut. My stomach lurched. I pushed back from the table, ready to run, but the waitress was already returning. She placed a plate in front of me. The burger looked normal, perfect even, but the bun was bleeding. Thick, dark liquid seeped out from between the bread, pooling onto the plate. The smell hit me like a punch, rotting flesh masked with burnt grease. The other customers had finally moved. They were all turned toward me now, silent, unblinking, waiting. The little girl shook her head slowly, barely noticeable. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh. "You know, I just remembered. I have to be somewhere." The waitress didn't react. I grabbed my keys and stood. The room shifted like the air had turned solid, pressing in around me. The customers all stood at the same time, their movements perfectly synchronized. I ran. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, my heart slamming against my ribs. The glass of the windows had changed. It was no longer a view of the parking lot outside. It was just darkness. Then behind me, I heard the wet sound of something crawling. I turned. The waitress was no longer human. Her limbs had stretched, her mouth split open too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Her fingers had elongated into claws, dripping with something black and thick. The thing that had been the little girl stood beside her now. Her face was gone, her eyes too large, her mouth not moving, but still whispering in my ear, "They're hungry." The other customers moved in unison, their bodies shifting, their limbs snapping into new, unnatural angles. The door behind me suddenly gave way, and I fell backwards into the night. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. My hands fumbled with the keys, and for a horrifying moment I thought the engine wouldn't start. Then the diner's lights went out. Everything was silent. The building was gone, just an empty lot. No cars, no signs, no diner. I didn't ask questions. I just drove. Hours later, when I finally found a real gas station, I sat in my car, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. I checked my phone. No GPS history of the route I had taken. No record of the diner ever existing. But when I looked down at my shirt, my stomach turned. There was something dark smeared across my sleeve. Something thick. Something that smelled like rotting meat. I burned my clothes that night. And now, whenever I pass an empty stretch of road with no sign of life, I wonder, was it waiting for someone else? Or had it been waiting for me all along? Story number 11. Final stop. I should have never taken that last ride home. It was late, and I had just wrapped up a long road trip. I was exhausted, my eyelids heavy, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. I knew I should have pulled into a motel, but I was only an hour from home. One more hour and I'd be in my own bed. That's what I kept telling myself. The road was empty, nothing but darkness swallowing the world around me. My high beams barely cut through the thick fog rolling in from the trees. My hands gripped the wheel tight, trying to focus, but fatigue was pressing hard against my mind. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it. A rideshare notification. That didn't make sense. I wasn't driving for a rideshare company anymore. I had deleted the app months ago. The screen flickered. Passenger awaiting pickup. My breath caught in my throat. The app wasn't even installed on my phone. I checked my rearview mirror, expecting to see an empty back seat, but there was someone sitting there, a woman, pale, still, wearing a simple black dress. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, her eyes locked onto mine through the mirror. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeched to a stop, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned in my seat, my breath ragged. The back seat was empty. I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind scrambled for an explanation. I was tired, too tired. I needed to get home. That was all. I pressed the gas and kept driving. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Passenger awaiting pickup. I swallowed hard, my hands clammy against the wheel. I forced myself to ignore it. It wasn't real, but then, in the mirror, she was there again. Closer this time. Her lips barely moved, but I heard her voice as if she was whispering right beside my ear. Turn around. I jerked the wheel, swerving onto the shoulder, my chest heaving. I turned in my seat again. Nothing. My fingers hovered over my phone, ready to throw it out the window. But before I could move, it buzzed one more time. I didn't want to look, but I did. Final stop ahead, drop-off required. A chill ran through me. I lifted my gaze to the road and saw a figure standing in the middle of the highway. A man, tall, motionless, wearing a driver's uniform. His head was tilted slightly as if listening. I hit the brakes. The car stopped on its own, the engine dying instantly. The headlights flickered. Then, my back door unlocked. A slow click echoed through the silence. The seatbelt in the back seat tightened, as if someone had just fastened it. I couldn't move. The man in the road smiled. The next thing I knew, my car was moving. Not forward, backward. I wasn't touching the wheel. The gas pedal wasn't pressed, but the car was rolling in reverse, smooth, controlled as if something else was driving. The GPS screen lit up, but the route was different. No roads, no names, just a single blinking destination. Final stop. The speed picked up. The air inside the car turned ice cold. My breath came out in shaky gasps. I gripped the wheel, trying to regain control, but it was locked in place. The woman in the mirror was still there. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at him, the driver. The man on the road was inside the car now, sitting next to me. His face was wrong, stretched, shifting, flickering like a bad signal. His smile never wavered. "You were chosen," he said, voice not human. The car sped up. The trees outside blurred into shadows that moved. The road beneath me was no longer asphalt, but something else, something pulsing, shifting. I was being taken somewhere that shouldn't exist. I did the only thing I could. I reached for the key and ripped it out of the ignition. The world snapped back. Suddenly, I was on the side of the road, my car idling in neutral. The engine was still running. The GPS was back to normal. The ride request was gone. And I was alone, no driver, no woman, no final stop. I sat there for a long time, shaking, my breath uneven. Then slowly, I put the car in drive and got back on the road, without looking in the mirror again. I never spoke about it. I never checked my rideshare account. But later that week I heard something on the news. A driver had vanished on that same stretch of road. His car was found, doors open, engine running. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, just one thing left behind on the back seat, a phone, still open to a rideshare request, passenger awaiting pickup, final stop.